This week, the ACC once again proved that it really doesn't know what it's doing, and its leadership has no real plan for the future. Jim Phillips, the conference's commissioner, had some pretty remarkably awful things to say that we're going to talk about today. But the best part was Michael Alford, Florida State's athletic director, who had me on the floor with his response. However, we'll start with Jim Phillips, we'll finish with Alford, and then we'll get you on your way. Hopefully you're having a good Friday. Hopefully you're enjoying the fireworks that went off at the ACC meetings in Amelia Island. Now, ACC Commissioner Jim Phillips had a couple of comments and thoughts on different things this week when brought up. In talking about the FSU Clemson lawsuits, he says it's difficult, it's disruptive, it's harmful. But that's the world we live in. They have the ability to do what they're doing. He did, though, have a caveat. He says that it hasn't changed the way that they've interacted with Florida State and Clemson. Specifically, he said it hasn't changed the way they've interacted with their student athletes, with the kids who are playing in the Atlantic Coast Conference. And I'll say this, I'll preface this, and we won't go complete bash Jim Phillips here. I would probably stand to agree with that. They probably are not treating Florida State and Clemson athletes any differently than they always have. I don't necessarily think that 18 to 22-year-olds need to get mixed up in the drama that is Florida State and the ACC. But I do want to call to your attention the fact that he says we aren't treating Florida State and Clemson any differently. To that, I would say, obviously, that's part of the problem. You've always treated Florida State and Clemson a certain way, and that's why we're in this mess. I wouldn't expect that you're treating Florida State and Clemson any differently than you always have. That's part of the problem. That's part of why we have these lawsuits going on. Florida State and Clemson are your breadwinners. They're who make you your money. They're the reason that you make over $2 million a year as the commissioner of this dying conference. And you've always treated them like the redheaded stepchildren. They're not on Tobacco Road. They're not a big basketball power. They're not Duke and Carolina or Wake or NC State or any of those programs that you love so mightily in North Carolina. So yes, Commissioner Phillips, you probably are still treating us the same way that we have felt mistreated for years and years and years, and it goes back farther than just the last year and a half where we've been covering conference realignment on this channel. It goes back decades. You've always treated Florida State and Clemson differently, specifically Florida State, and we wouldn't expect you to treat us any differently now. I thought the irony in this comment was hilarious. Next up, he was asked about the ACC's contract with ESPN, and the irony in the last quote turns into a full-blown lie. You know, there's coach speak in anything that happens. Coaches, when asked about an injury or asked about something that happened on the team, an arrest, or just something that's not necessarily going to be viewed in the most positive light, coaches will coach speak that. Right? We're going to deal with that internally. We're not necessarily going to release all the details. We may know it's an ACL, and a coach will say it's a lower body injury. There's coach speak. There's ways around it. There's ways to basically say nothing when you give a response. And that's what most people do in uncomfortable answers. Not what Jim Phillips did when the ESPN contract was brought up. He said the ESPN contract runs through 2036, and we're working internally with them on a piece of that contract. Well, what is the piece of that contract they're working on? I'll get back to the quote. Whether or not they're going to extend it. He said the partnership is not going away or being affected in a negative way at all. It's a look in, and we're handling some of what that states. Now, Brett McMurphy reminds you that the ESPN option must be picked up by February of 2025. I've been told that they've already let the ACC know that they're not going to extend that. Things change. Things happen in different areas. But I don't believe that they're just working or looking at a piece of the contract. I think this thing is done. ESPN's not extending. If the chance of Florida State and Clemson not being around is even remotely possible, Add in North Carolina, Miami, NC State, Virginia Tech, Virginia to that as well. There's no chance they would extend that. They're not just looking at a piece of it. They're looking at the whole thing going away. Pates told you about it. They can unilaterally end the thing. And as Commissioner Phillips told this bold-faced lie, moments later, a source reached out to Ross Dellinger of Yahoo Sports and said, no, this isn't the situation. ESPN can end this thing one of two ways. Number one, they can just cancel the thing by February of 2025, which, again, I believe they've already told the ACC they're going to do. Or Florida State can leave the league, and if they fall below the 15 required members, the composition clause kicks in, and ESPN can then cancel it. I think one of those two things happens. I think Jim Phillips is full of crap. It was very interesting that he gave that comment, and Ross Dellinger from Yahoo Sports immediately corrected it. I don't know exactly how. My guess would be that sources at the network, sources at ESPN, reached out and said, yeah, he's wrong here. This is not how it's going to go down. And so they leaked the information to Dellinger, something that we had reported on our national channel on College Football Addiction. You can see it above me weeks ago, that they could end it if Florida State or Clemson leave. His wording, his verbiage was almost that exactly. If Florida State leaves before Cal and Stanford or SMU join, they're out. There was a question about Cal, Stanford, and SMU joining. And this one, to me, was maybe the most hilarious. The first one was ironic. The second one was a lie. And then this one was just brutal honesty. Question about SMU officially joining on July 1st, but Cal and Stanford not joining until August 2nd. When asked about it, Jim Phillips said, I have no idea why, but it happens. If there was ever a quote to sum up where this conference is, if there was ever a t-shirt that you should buy and wear at any ACC event that you ever are at for the rest of eternity, it would be this one. I have no idea why, but it happens. In fact, here's a picture of a t-shirt that I think some of you should find yourselves in Charlotte and wear to the ACC kickoff when it happens in July. We'll talk about what Michael Alford said in just a moment, but first I do want to give some love to Rohan Law. I appreciate Rohan Law for all that they do for our channel, all that they do to update you guys on what's going on with the ACC FSU lawsuits. They do a phenomenal job over on Twitter. Doug Rohan of Rohan Law, you can follow at Rohan Law PC on Twitter, X, whatever you call it, if you want more updates from a legal perspective on what's going on with the FSU and ACC court cases. Also, if you're in the Atlanta area and you're hurt or injured, make sure that Rohan Law is your very first call. Follow them on social. If you're not in Georgia, if you are in Georgia, do the same. But if you are there in the Atlanta area or in Georgia, make sure that Rohan Law has you taken care of if you are ever in need of their services. Rohan Law wants to be your best friend on your worst day. Now, Alfred's response is probably my favorite part of anything that came out of the meetings. Alfred's very calculated. Anytime I've ever chatted with him or we've had him on here or I've seen him in person, he doesn't necessarily hold back, but he's also very, very strategic in what he says. Asked this week if the FSU ACC marriage was salvageable, Alfred didn't miss the mark at all. He said, we'll just wait for that to play out. We have great partners in this conference, great relationships. But at the end of the day, we've got to do what's best for Florida State and look at the changing environment of college athletics and make sure we're there to be successful. I thank Brandon Marcello for the quote. But Alfred doesn't really care about friendships or relationships or great partners that we have in the ACC. So many people make this a personal thing. It's really not. It's not a personal thing at all. I've seen people say that there's too much greed and there's too much of this or there's too much of that. And those people just do not understand the basic nature of where college athletics are right now. Florida State has a top 15 revenue in all of college football. And the fact that they're able to do that with a $30 million gap between the SEC and the Big Ten is remarkable. But they will not be able to compete, especially when this new law goes into effect of paying players, especially when the TV contracts continue to dwarf what the ACC has. Heck, the Big 12 is going to make more than the ACC very soon. And Alfred knows this. Alfred's not worried about relationships or personal things. I saw a puff piece come out from Dennis Dodd this week talking about how Jim Phillips goes to Mass every day. And Jim Phillips probably is a great guy. He's probably a very nice guy. And I'll say this. He was given an impossible task of fixing a conference that was completely broken. I don't necessarily disregard that. I don't necessarily think that Jim Phillips is just a terrible guy that's trying to screw over Florida State. I think he's trying to do anything he can to save the conference. And he was put in an impossible situation by a guy who was very involved in nepotism and a lot of things that were inappropriate in former Commissioner Swofford. Jim Phillips is not a bad guy, but that doesn't matter. Him being a nice guy is not worth our athletic program just completely going down the drain and getting down the tank. You've already seen the leaps and bounds that the SEC and other conferences have made in other sports. They're dominating baseball. They're dominating softball right now. They dominated basketball this last season. And that's going to continue to increase because they've already got football locked. And they're going to continue to win at every other level as well. And Alfred sees that. Florida State sees that. Clemson sees that. North Carolina, with all their turmoil, they see that. And at the end of the day, Alfred's quote rings true. We have to make sure we're there to be successful. When he says there, I don't think he's talking about a specific conference. I don't think he's talking about the SEC or the Big 10 or the Big 12 or the ACC. I don't think he's talking about a specific conference. I think he's talking about survival in general. I think he's saying we need to make sure we're around to be successful. Because at $40 or $50 million of a revenue gap between media deals and the playoff deal, we can't survive. We cannot survive the way that we want to. And so you can hate on Florida State if you're not a Florida State fan. You can hate on Florida State if you're a Duke basketball fan or you're an ACC lover like that idiot attorney that's on social media. You can do any of that. But you just have to understand where they're coming from, and they just want to survive. The turmoil at UNC right now is pretty fun to watch. We covered that again at College Football Addiction. You can go check that out after this video if you haven't subscribed over there. But the turmoil going on there, it sounds a lot like what happened when Florida State was gearing up to get ready to leave. Now, it doesn't sound like anything's imminent there, and you've got some people throwing their hat in the ring and trying to delay things at UNC so that they don't necessarily get started with going full tilt at the ACC just yet. But all of that situation is mighty fun to watch. And it's going to be a fun day when UNC turns their back on the ACC. When Florida State and Clemson did it, when your stepchildren essentially did it, whatever, right? You expected that. But when your prized possession, when Tobacco Road turns their back on you, that's when I think it gets really serious. We should have updates coming with Doug Rohan next week from some of the lawsuit aspects. But at the end of the day, a hilarious week in Amelia Island. A week that further illustrates the point. The ACC has no plan. They have no idea what they're doing. There's no leadership that could possibly get them out of the mess that other conference commissioners dug for them. And we're in a holding pattern. We're in a wait-and-see pattern. I think there's a great chance that Florida State does some things over the next couple of weeks, over the next couple of months, that do break them out of this thing. We'll see. It's all kind of speculative at this point, but I appreciate you guys tuning in. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to talk with you down in the comments about it. But the ACC is a sinking ship. Hats off to Commissioner Phillips for going down with it. Hats off to the loyalists, the defenders of this conference, the Georgia Tech and Wake and Duke fans that are doing everything they can to try and keep Florida State in the league through their tweets, through their lawsuits they're filing, whatever. But this thing's going down, and we all know it. We all see it. And this week at Amelia Island further proved that. I appreciate you guys for tuning in. Again, thank you, Doug Rohan and Rohan Law, for your support, not only of the channel, but also of all things that are going down with these lawsuits. We'll talk with Doug next week. Make sure you're subscribed, locked in, so you don't miss that. Appreciate you guys a ton. We'll talk to you soon. Go Noles.